pacem, pacem, dona nobis 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 pacem, dona nobis.
I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, welcome you on this very special day of Sunday Dialogue of Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming. Today, we have invited Professor Heike Patomaki, who is an eminent professor of world politics, and he has worked with many institutions, and he is known for international relation, understanding, and globalization and human security. Thank you, Professor Anant Kumar Giri, to join this session as the chair of the session. Minati Pradhan, Professor Gwalior, and all our viewers. Today, we have invited Professor Patomaki to discuss about his book, Debating the War in Ukraine. This book is interesting in the sense because, this book talks about that the Ukraine war could have been avoided. And if so, how? This is a kind of dialogical book. Professor Heike Patomaki discuss the nodal points of history in terms of counterfactuals and constructive explanations. It also talks about the role of NATO, the role of international politics, and also the future possibilities. So, this book has been written by two authors, Thomas Forsberg and Heike Patomaki. This book is not a kind of deterministic writing, which we often see whenever we talk about Ukraine war. We see a kind of deterministic points. But this book is a kind of dialogical writing. And in the very introduction, the title Professor Heike wrote, looking at the war in Ukraine and ways it could end from a global perspective. It also understands globalization and human security, concerning the dimension of war, peace, and security. So first I would like to request Ananta Kumar Giri to initiate the discussion. And for our audience, uh, I want to give a brief introduction to Professor Heike Patomaki's introduction. He is a professor of world politics and the vice director of the Center of Excellence in Global Governance Research at the University of Helsinki, Finland. He was also associated with RMIT University in Australia, Melbourne. Uh, Patamoki's research is very interesting because he talks about emancipatory methodology of global governance. He rather use the word world's politics, and in his research interest, his philosophy and methodology of social sciences, global political economy, global features, peace research, and the political theories of global justice and democracy. Before this book, debating the war in Ukraine, the one book that is very popular is The Political Economy of Global Security, War, Future Crisis, and Changes in Global Governance, which was published by Rotes in 2008. So I see a kind of logical coherence between earlier writing and this book. First, I request Professor Anant Kumar Giri to initiate the session. Meanwhile, we will try to connect Professor Aikin and Patron. Hope he will join very soon. Yes, Ananta bhai, over to you.
Thank you, dear Randhir. Thank you, Gyan. Thank you, Minati, and our friends co-present. Now, Professor Patomaki is a very deep thinker and a kind human being, and a kind of reflective activist of the world. This dialogical work that we are engaging with, debating the war in Ukraine, and which is a dialogue between Thomas Forsberg and Heikki Patomäki, both of them at University of Helsinki, is a culmination of Professor Patomäki's work for at least last 35 years. And he's rather a young man, and he studied in Finland, and then he came to England, and he interacted with the great philosopher uh, Roy Bhaskar. And Roy Bhaskar had initiated a very important way of thinking about reality called critical realism. And Professor Patomaki was a participant in this very interesting way of looking at reality in philosophy, economics, politics, and international relations. He wrote a book way back in the 1990s called After International Relations. So, that critical realist perspective on international relations, which means that things as they exist, which can be viewed from a realistic point of view, is not everything there that is to reality or realism. And reality, for example, this book, reality of, say, Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent war. It is a reality, but how do we understand it? And understanding, we can do it in terms of a naive sense of realism, as we may know that in IR studies, realism is an approach, or as it exists, the geopolitical relations and There is another approach called normativity or idealism. But critical realism, it cultivates a very creative and critical way in between, that there are realities and realities. But we are not prisoners of reality. We could make a difference to reality. And this difference to reality in the direction of normative hope and emancipatory possibilities. So that methodology of critical realism has been a very profound, companion with Professor Patomaki's thinking, as it is reflected in this book. But that also has been accompanied by his participation in varieties of movements towards alternative global condition. He has also recently written a book on the world state, just come out from Routledge. As Randhir has mentioned his earlier work on security, but attention must be paid to his other work on political economy. And I have been very happy to get a copy of that book. And rethinking global political economy after the financial crisis. And in this book on war on Ukraine, Professor Patomaki is bringing the dimension of political economy to understand the invasion as well as the war. So, in this book on political economy, he introduces a very interesting theme, a theme in both ways, a theme as it exists in social reality, and a theme as a methodology of investigation, what can be called as a heuristic. Heuristic is something that we want to understand this. That does not mean we subscribe to this or we are offering it as an ideological slogan. And that theme is heteroreflexivity. What is heteroreflexivity? Is that any society, any social reality is not just a mechanical reality, it has a reflective dimension. So, society is reflecting on itself. And this is a theme, for example, in sociology. Randhir might know the great work of Niklas Luhmann. There were two important thinkers from Germany. One is Jürgen Habermas, who is much more known, but another important thinker is called Niklas Luhmann. And Luhmann also was reflecting upon that how a system can reflect on itself. So, system reflecting on itself. But that system reflecting on itself is nourished by people living in this system reflecting on both the system and themselves. So, this methodology of heteroreflexivity, the theme that Professor Patomaki is discussing in his book on political economy, is deeply significant, like our social order, political order, our contemporary condition has a dimension of heteroreflexivity, complex heteroreflexivity. And we need to understand this dynamics of heteroreflexivity. So the present book is in that line. As for example, so he in dialogue with Thomas Forestberg, he is bringing this notion of counterfactual history. Counterfactual history means history that could have been. And supposing, like in case of war on Ukraine and the subsequent war, Russian invasion of Ukraine, now supposing that this Minsk agreement that was agreed upon, that was respected, and supposing in 2000 and both of them agree that there was a fatal mistake by the NATO and the powers, the geopolitical power, to declare that both Georgia and and Ukraine would be made members of NATO. Now, suppose it was not made, and then that really led to subsequent kind of aggressions, Russian annexation of Crimea and others. But even then, even in the last moment, or even before that, say 2 years ago, if there were a lot of commitment to the Minsk agreement, then it would have been different. This is on the one side. Secondly, both of them agreed that because Thomas Frostberg is very critical of Russia, and he's saying that this Russian invasion of uh, Ukraine is the main problem. Yes, it is. Therefore, when I hear the word that Ukrainian conflict, it is a way of hiding the truth. It is Russian invasion of Ukraine. Even in our language, we are not using that. And unfortunately, in a related way, the kind of the way today there is the clever way of using language which hides us from reality. In a related sense, since primary victims of war, and this is something that both of the authors agree, and this is also a deep challenge from another friend of ours who joined in our Swadhyaya Chakra, Professor Boiventura de Sousa Santos. He also has been a critic of this war, but critic of this war from both the point of view, and he challenged us that Russian invasion of Ukraine is a crime. But is the provocation for this war, is it not a crime? All the factors that went into, is it not a crime? After the end of Cold War, the deliberate destruction of Russian economy, and then the destruction of Yugoslavia, and is it not a crime? And then with all these things, he is challenging us to realize that the victims of the war are the people of Ukraine and people of Russia to begin with. But today, the victims of the war are all of us all over the world. So, Randhir, you can note whenever Professor Patomaki comes, you give me a hint, I would stop. So,
Okay.
continuing this, because today the victims of the war is not only the people of Russia, people of Ukraine, and people of Russia, and mainly women and children. And so, a related problem of language is that all over the world, as in Manipur, as in Ukraine, everywhere, rape has been an instrument of war. But that is also rape is a pervasive violence. But today, the way we are reporting rape is, oh, it is some misconduct. In Odia, it is called duskarma, not dharsana. So today, there is a sugar cutting of language that we must immediately interrogate and come to the point that it is not just conflict, Ukrainian conflict, it is Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent war, which is being fueled by many, many factors, including war industry. Professor Boiventura de Sousa Santos, he also brings another challenge. That challenge is that today all these Euro-American powers, I am now in the USA and the Biden administration, and let me not forget to bring how the war here is affecting all of us. We know that there is a global food crisis today. And in our Parliament of World Religion, I was listening to a very deep thinker of international relations who comes from the Baha'i faith, and she is proposing for a system of collective security. And we do not have a system of collective security. But before I discuss that, what this professor challenged us to realize, and she is an open professor, maybe because of that, she looks at the challenge in a very interconnected way, as a wave of relations, global food crisis, Africa, all of us are today affected. Hunger has increased, and the energy crisis, and everything, the cost, and everything. So, therefore, the other aspect of this war and the kind of the fueling the war machine, of course, there has to be movement towards negotiated peace, and in this book there are some proposals about it. But the immediate challenge is Professor De Sousa Santos is writing in a recent post that that a large number of weapons, supplied to Ukraine could enter the illegal arms market and end up in the hands of criminals. So this is another challenge. What is? Secondly, of course, the challenge of nuclear war. And our respected professor also brought that even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, how close we are to nuclear war. And this professor said, now the latest document is saying that it was almost that was going to happen, and one Russian soldier was diving under towards the submarine to create his nuclear, press the nuclear button, but his head got stuck and therefore he could not reach in time. Just see, suppose it had not happened. As there was another very important, fortunate, it's a blessings that there was another such situation when in Russia or in USSR, there was one person who was handling the nuclear signal and he received a false signal. But the computer was saying that the nuclear word should be pressed, but he had a second thought. Suppose he had pressed that, and there has been documentary about it. So the challenge of illegal, misuse of arms supply to Ukraine and nuclear war. So all these are very difficult challenges for humanity, including the war moving to a kind of a world war. It is in this context, this book is deeply significant, and significant in the sense that the two participants, they do not share everything. They have different points of view. Professor Forsberg, is very sympathetic to the position of Ukrainian position and Western allies, NATO. And once we talk to people of Ukraine, in fact, our Baha'i professor was telling, when President Zelensky came to USA and he was speaking to Congress, in terms of the proposal for collective security, his proposal was that let there be a system where the moment one country invades the other, within 24 hours, this collective security force comes and stops it. So these are the challenges for collective security that we do not have. And this Baha'i professor was proposing that the war on Ukraine and the subsequent war is a manifestation of the adolescent stage in which we are. But we have to move from adolescent warmongering to maturity. and it requires multiple movements, including heteroreflexivity. And with Professor Patamaki, the challenge of heteroreflexivity is accompanied by ethical learning. So, at least the challenge before us is how do we learn with and from this war, not to repeat it again. And what is the source of ethical learning here? As in the Mahabharata war also, if you look at, there were justification for war, but Kunti says, the mother of the Kauravas, our mother Kunti, in the final moment, she talks to Krishna. He says that you are the one person who could have stopped the war, but you didn't really do your best. And therefore, I curse you that your own clan would also end like that. And what happened to the lineage of Lord Krishna, Yadavas, they also ended in mutual killing. So, therefore, how do we learn this whole ethical learning is based upon the question of suffering. In Mahabharata, when the question is to Vyasadeva, what is punya and what is papa? And papa is parapidana, harming others, injuring others. And punya is paropokara. So the ethical learning from this war is also, despite the war in Mahabharata, there were some codes in Islam also. In the Parliament of World Religion, I listened to many deep conversations on and with Islam. One of the injunction in Islam is, and by Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him, that whenever there is war, there must be a ethical binding not to harm women and children and the innocent. Now, this ethical binding is not there. Interestingly, what we call as the warmongering people, like those who fight in the name of religion, they had some sensitivity to some of these ethical codes. But today we do not have that. So, moving on then, so how do we learn with this war and move towards peace? And there are many sides to it. Of course, both the writers agree, and I quote this line from their book: amid divergent interpretations, we agree that there was something irrational about the way that Russian decision makers disregarded the very high risks of the war. Yeah, it is a fact. As a result, everybody is bleeding now. The people of Russia, people of Ukraine. So, moving on then, how do we move from this to movements towards peace and hope? One of the themes that the authors provide is a theme called dialectical hope. And they write, the dialectical hope is that contradictory, conflicts in a critical debate which could be genuinely constructive. Like the dialectical debate between these two authors, which becomes a source of dialectical hope. That dialectical hope also becomes a mother of an ecology of hope. And another interesting thing is that the very methodology of counter factual, it does not that everything is possible, but in a given historical context, many things could have been possible. Patamaki, he writes, instead of ultimate causes, we have to look at geohistorical layers. And another very interesting methodological point he makes, epistemologically, our problems as researchers concerns how to recognize similar horizontal events and vertical persistent structures relations in a reasonable manner, given that best analogies are only partial. So this book has many dimensions, one terms of methodology, of understanding, as well as the substantive dimension, and how we all make a contribution to stop the war and move towards peace, but that also requires a detailed understanding of histories, the contemporaries, and a sense of agency that all of us can make a contribution to ending the war and move towards sustainable peace. So, thank you, and let us have discussions, please.
Uh, Thank you so much, Ananta bhai. Thank you so much for bringing a kind of deep understanding of the book. Uh, I was uh, reading one interview by a scholar and Professor Patamukhi. In that interview, uh, the first question he answered was somebody asked him that how did the conflict, Ukraine and not and Russia, excellate again in the recent month. He answered by saying that there are many possible explanations for this. Some of them are quite speculative, and we can see a kind of speculative and many arguments which are sometimes very suspicious but without any factual explanation. He said that Russia's position in the world economy is deteriorating with the general move away from fossil fuels. Now Russia must act now if it is to retain its greater power status. However, oil and gas revenues to the Russia state have been on average rising, and in 2021 they were higher than ever. Another possible explanation, Professor Patanuki talks about that. um, Putin felt a kind of deep frustration as years of negotiations and uh, diplomatic attempt have led nowhere. But a mere psychological explanation hardly helps us to understand the beginning of the war. It is more realistic to look at the dynamics of the conflict in eastern Ukraine and the development of Ukraine's NATO membership project. Um, the second question is very interesting, which I would like to read. When the interviewer asked him that what is the role of West moving closer to Ukraine in this conflict, he said that uh, Western military technical support to Ukraine actually strengthened the country's armed forces, which is a principle, uh, which in principle, could have opened up the possibility for a military solution. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, he actually sought to find a negotiated solution in 2019. The solution would have include holding election in the uh, Donetsk and Luhansk, regions, and withdrawing Russia's unmarked troops. The plan met widespread resistance in Ukraine, While it was also, evident that the Ukraine state does not have control over all armed forces. That is something which I found very, very interesting. Uh, is saying that Ukraine state, it means Ukrainian state does not have, control over all the armed forces that fought against the separatists and the Russians as the plan failed and the violent conflict continued. Russia, began to gather troops near the Ukrainian border, while Zelensky, began to rush Ukrainian NATO membership in the winter and spring in 2021. Uh, the conflict began to actually um, escalate, rapidly, uh, though increasing the war of, you know, and in 2021, the Zelensky administration organized a Crimean forum aimed at returning the Crimean Peninsula to Ukrainian rule. The forum was attended by more than 45 countries, and that was very, very shocking for uh, you know Putin. And it seems that the Russian point of view that was running out, either it would have to withdraw the Ukraine uh, in one way or another, possibly even abandon, Crimea and accept Ukrainians NATO membership, or it must find a way to move the negotiations forward, based on the Minsk agreement and Ukrainians' non-alignment. In this situation, Putin's regime decided to launch a second phase to build military readiness on Ukrainians' borders and begin to demand talk with Ukrainian and the United States. Ukraine and the West refused Russia's demand, and that has become a kind of catalyst of all this thing. And Putin and his inner circle itself found themselves in a very corner, isolated, and classical rules of wise diplomacy says that concerning oneself or the other party should always be avoided. After the failure of negotiations, the Putin regime could only retreat with the loss of its face and or uh, escalate further the conflict into a larger scale of war. So, while I was reading that interview, it really, uh, solved the very speculative answers or speculations towards this war. And in that interview, he also, talked about the history of Russia's and NATO relationships, which are very, very, which is very, very important, and and how NATO contribute to Putin's aggression against Ukraine. That is also very, very important because I found. Professor Heike Patamoki is a critical realist, and he has very, very, interesting insight to to find to find a kind of very, very interesting, global political conflict. So. I think we should invite Professor Gyan to share some of his understanding regarding this conflict. Yes, Professor Gyan.
Yes, yes, I am here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, yes, it is difficult to add something to all those you and Professor Giri have already said. I personally have the impression, but I would like to really to listen to listen to the considerations of the professor from Finland. But anyway, as regards my impression of the our crisis is that I am not so convinced that the crisis has begun 2022 or that the crisis has begun 2014 with the problems in Odessa and the question of Crimean Peninsula. I do not think either that the first point of the crisis was when there was the first Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. I do not think personally that the question can be limited to the Ukraine, the questions of Ukraine and Russia. I think that the problems, the root of all these questions is perhaps already in the Cold War. That is, I do not think that we can judge, or at least that I can judge, evaluate the situation without considering the Cold War, the drawbacks of the Cold War, and of course the different strategies which the two fronts have applied in order to extend their influences when the Soviet Union existed. But anyway, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think that there have been, so to speak, different curtains of crisis, which all have the common sign that they are contrast between NATO or US on the one hand, and on the other hand, those countries which are not countries of NATO, and of course Russia in this case. I think I have the impression that the first curtain was Yugoslavia. That is the first real confrontation between the two blocs, where the crisis in Yugoslavia, the collapse of Yugoslavia, and the rigid separation between, for instance, on the one hand, Slovenia, Croatia, which were the first countries to go away from Yugoslavia, and that what remained of former Yugoslavia, and in particular Serbia. And this was the first card and the first battle, so to speak, the first battlefield between the two blocks. At that time, in the 90s, Russia was weak and could not defend the traditional ties with Serbia, so that Serbia was under attack. And there was, of course, also the huge massacres in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But the confrontation, the first explosion was, in my opinion, that in Europe at least, and it was the first theater of crisis, which involved, from on the one hand Russia and or traditional allies of Russia, and on the other hand countries which wanted to go, so to speak, westwards, like Russia and Slovenia, which were also then we became full members of the European Union. And I have the impression that this of Ukraine now is, so to speak, a repetition of this constant condition of war between the blocks, even though the war is not held between the countries within the two great blocks, but between, so to speak, little allies of these blocks. And I think that there is a continuity between the crisis of Yugoslavia and the collapse of Yugoslavia. Then the problems, the huge problems in Yugoslavia for 10 years, and then the bombing of Belgrade in 2000, 2001, if I'm not mistaken. And then the crisis, which then extended to the territory of Ukraine and to Donbass. I think that I would not be amazed in case that once the crisis of Ukraine is solved with an armistice, I can imagine, for instance, that something happens as it was in Korea, with separation, rigid separation without a really peace treaty between Ukraine and Russia. But I can imagine that once this is solved, there will be another conflict in Europe. I do not know where. It could be perhaps in Transnistria. It could be, or it could be in another place. But there is a continuous condition of tension between, on the one hand, NATO, and on the other hand, Russia. And all follows from this, And I think we should see, at least this is my impression, Ukraine, the crisis in Ukraine as a continuation with other medals and with in a different territory of one and the same root, that is hostility between NATO and Russia. This was in Yugoslavia, and it was then in the first Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And then it is now with the declared war in Ukraine. Until this hostility between the two blocs continues, I think that we cannot imagine that there will be an end of the condition of war. That is, the war in Ukraine can go over, can be ended, but there will be always, in my opinion, potentiality of conflict due to this condition of hostility. This is what the impression which I have, that is the present crisis is a crisis which is a continuation of a crisis which broke out 1991 at least, when there were the first collapse of Yugoslavia. And in a certain sense, it is a drawback and a continuation of the Cold War. Of course, the discussion can be also extended, because